We're here to talk about WebID, which is a project that we've sort of spun up. We've moved into the YCG. Where this has been by mostly people at Google, although we've been soliciting actively external participation in it. And we have other people involved in this are Sam Goto and Majid Falapur. So this is there's the WCG address if anyone wants to see it, or to read the explainer that we have up, and or submit issues. And there's some active discussion there. Okay. All right. So just to go over a little bit what federated identity is, which I suspect most people have at least a high-level understanding of what's going on. This is the idea that a service called an identity provider can make assertions about you to other websites on the web. And those other websites we call relying parties. They consume the information about the user. The identity provider, you've created an account with them, and then you authorize them to do certain actions. And most of the use case that we're primarily concerned with right at the moment, and that this is talking about, is the most common one, which is federated sign-in. Because you've seen the screens on various websites all over the place that offer to let you sign in with Google, with Apple, with Facebook, and so forth, and then other identity providers that exist. Now, we see this as broadly a good thing. The fact is, it's better than people having passwords on every different website, which leads to all sorts of security problems and is terrible in terms of usability also. Enabling federation to continue to work is we think, very important for the web, and particularly around the identity systems and account systems. The trouble is, and why we are looking at this project and trying to figure things out, is that they rely on a lot of what we consider like general purpose web primitives. That identity protocols exist independent of the web. They've been developed over the last 20 years. OAuth, OpenID, OpenID Connect, SAML. These are not web-specific protocols, but they've been written to how to work on the web and specified without any browser involvement, without any any specialized JavaScript APIs. These are just things like they use redirects and pop-ups. And here we have an example of the problem that a flow that relies on pop-ups, when we implement pop-up blockers on the web, can cause problems for those entirely legitimate flows. But it doesn't stop with pop-ups. Like the flows as they exist today involve cross-origin iframes with third-party cookies, which of course we know those are being locked down by most browsers, and we have link decoration on navigations and redirects, so that we basically personal information being passed over those channels. And yeah, and post-morph message going across origins. All of these, to some extent, are used for tracking, and this is the big problem that we have to deal with. Third-party cookie access is the one in front. That's the one that browsers are mostly that for a while now, various browsers have been trying to lock down, Chrome among them, but it is used for entirely legitimate identity use cases when you're trying to sign in. And the issue overall is that the way that it's used is indistinguishable from how trackers use it as well. Effectively, you need to have if you're going to embed an iframe that's going to try to do some kind of identity operation, it needs to have access to first-party storage. The same way that trackers need access to first-party storage in order to track you with a hidden pixel or the tracking pixel. And going forward past third-party cookies, you have other kinds of tracking, like what we call navigational or bounce tracking, where you can use redirects so that a tracking site can use its first-party keep access to its first-party cookies And identifying information is passed to either by post message or by decoration on the link. And that can that enables the sort of effectively the same kind of thing that Tracking Pixels did, although slightly less transparently. And this closely resembles the identity flows that exist that are most common now, which is to say, I click a sign in with a Facebook button. It navigates me to facebook.com if I need to Facebook make sure that I'm okay with sharing my information back to this website that I'm trying to sign into. I say okay, and then it gives me some an identifier back to the website, the exact same way that a tracker would if this was a tracking situation. And it's the problem is the inability to distinguish between these two kinds of flows. One that the user may not like or may not have consented to or be okay with, and one that the user would see as completely reasonable. Beyond that, there are some specific tracking and privacy consequences that are associated with identity on the web. One of them is the fact that there are global identifiers on the web, or there are global identifiers associated that are typically passed in these flows, such as your email address. Your email address you were probably used to using as a username on websites. But every time you enter it in a website, then effectively that's a global identifier that the website can use and get together with all sorts of other sites. And this is something that we call joinability. It can join the email addresses from all the databases and build a tracking profile of you. As large as there are as many relying parties that are participating in this, which incidentally we've heard of happening. And so this is one that we're also thinking about, how to enable better user control over those kinds of flows. And a final one is specific to federation, and that when you use an IDP to sign into an RP, the IDP knows who you are and they know what relying party you are signing into. And they just learn that it's a natural part of it. And there are some good reasons to do that, some benefits of it. It allows the IDPs to do some kinds of fraud detection. It allows the IDPs to keep track of who you've signed into and who you've given that information to, and then you can look at the list of them through management interfaces that they expose. But it's also a de facto tracker, and something, again, that the user doesn't necessarily have control over, which we need to think about. So getting into sort of the solution space of how we're thinking about trying to solve this problem of protecting it, protecting federation flows that currently work today, which is our goal, and maximizing privacy and user control of personal information while we're doing it. I have that note at the bottom, which is very important, that this is still early days. Nothing is considered final in terms of what the things I'm putting out here. And a lot depends on feedback that we get from potentially other browsers, relying parties, identity providers, and the broader identity ecosystem who we're working on. And the reason it's not final is that it's a really hard problem, it turns out. Like, as I mentioned, there's just 2 decades of identity protocols evolving. OpenID Connect's been around for about 10 years. And you've probably seen it over the last few years become more and more common on the web as it gains adoption. And these things tend to move slowly, and we're trying to move as quickly as possible. And there's all sorts of problems, like enterprise use cases. Like, how do we cover all of them? Because it's used. These technologies are also used in government, EDU, corporations. Then there's a question of how do we actually deploy it, since given, again, the track record of these things taking forever to actually gain adoption and it being a slow-moving train. And how do we do this? How do we maximize, how can we allow for usability as well as maintaining privacy properties that the user wants? And how can also we make sure that the developers can maintain as much control as they want over over the flows in the application, like web developers, that we don't lock them into flows that we've decided are okay, and then if they want to vary from the to try something new or innovate on them, that they're prevented from doing so by the browsers. One of the things which is a little bit separate from what we're talking about below, but is there's a notion of directed identifiers, or also called pairwise identifiers, depending on which kind of spec you're reading, which is basically the notion that this is the one of the what we call the RP tracking problem, which I described before, that relying parties get global identifiers right now, like your email address. And we would like to encourage IDPs to start issuing directed identifiers in order to make it not possible to join all the identifiers from different IDPs. So basically, if I sign into New York Times with my Facebook or Google account, they will get a notion of me that cannot be joined or correlated to that same sign-in with the same account on, let's say, WashingtonPost.com. So they would not see, they would see me as two different people, even though they're generated from the same account. So that's the directed idea. And so we're trying to build this into this proposal. Effectively, these inherently have lower tracking risks, so we think we can have better user flows if these are implemented. And further, if we can get people to adopt a scheme where the browser can verify that they are directed identifiers and that the user doesn't need to be concerned about this kind of tracking risk when this flow is happening. It lets us distinguish this from other use cases where just random batches of bits are passing on and we have no idea what semantics are underlying them. We don't really know exactly how it's going to look, but at a high level, we're taking what we have now today, which is, I described like typically redirect flows, although sometimes iframe-based flows with pop-ups. And we want to just add an API that the relying party can call. And then the browser will, under the covers, try to take care of actually managing the details of the information exchange with the IDP in a privacy-preserving way. So again, this is just an example code of what it might look like. But yeah, there's a lot of details not being shown here, which gets us into the big question that we're sort of that we've been spinning around for a while, which is that in trying to figure out all the different ways that we can do this, we came up with three basic categories of them, that they all fall into. One is, and they sort of correspond to how do we perceive the browser's role, or the role of this API in these flows. The first one is what we call permission-oriented variation, which is to say, in this case, the browser is relatively agnostic about what's happening. All it's doing is it's enabling these flows through a new channel, which is the API. And when it gets invoked, the browser just takes it upon itself to identify any tracking risk that is being created by these flows, or any new tracking risk that hasn't already existed, and warning the user and getting them to click through a prompt if they do. So typically, this is there's variations within this, and we can consider some specific decisions and trade-offs. So this is typically what it might look like. So on the left frame, you see if somebody's clicked the button to initiate a federated login, the browser sees that hasn't been used before in this site. They haven't. So they prompted the user to make sure to do it. Then if they don't, the second screen would be the IDP's sign-in site or a sign-in page that exists today. The user clicks through that, and then possibly you get another prompt. We might be able to reduce the number of prompts by 1, depending on some of the trade-offs we're okay with. But this is sort of what it would look like. And there are downsides with this. This isn't the most usable thing. It's reminiscent a bit of request storage access, which also has similar pros and cons. But but that's one way of looking at this problem, that the browser is going to be as agnostic as possible, just concern itself with the tracking risk, and then offer some identity-specific text, which would possibly help the user get through it more often. A second way is that the browser becomes a little bit more knowledgeable and opinionated on what's going on, and would try to take over some of the IDP responsibilities for itself in as many situations as possible. Here we see that the user is clicking on it. The user clicks on the federated sign-in option. And sorry, I just see that somebody asked for the slide thing. There you go. Yeah, so that it becomes opinionated. So when you click on it, now the browser attempts to learn about, or can learn about, the accounts that you have with the IDP, and offer you options. So in this case, the green is browser rendered UI. In this screen, we don't actually see any IDP rendered UI at all. So the advantage here is that the browser can ensure that all tracking risks, there's text to identifying all tracking risks, that we can make sure that or try to offer the user an option to select directed identifiers, which corresponds to the checked box in the bottom right. And yeah, it becomes a bit easier to reduce the number of clicks that are involved and improve the user experience. The downside is that this is browser rendered UI and rather than IDP rendered UI, so we kind of take away some developer options when we do this. And also it adds a lot more complexity in and may limit the use cases that it applies to, since we can obviously only do this for use cases that we anticipate. Okay. So one thing is that the last thing I talked about in the tracking section above is the risk of what we call IDP tracking, which is the fact that the IDP gets to know wherever you're using wherever you're using the a federated sign-in or federated identity action, which gives them a lot of information. And maybe you're fine with that. Maybe you would rather have some approach. Maybe you would rather have some control over it. Or is there a way to use federation if there's no identity provider that I trust that much, or I'd rather not, or if I could trust them rather less, then maybe I'd be more likely to use it, or I use it more often. And none of the above scenario or variations does anything about that problem. And there's a reason for that, which is that it's basically hard to avoid given the existing identity protocols, like OpenID Connect, and the way that we envision federation and the way the identity providers think about the service that they're offering. So we tried to think a bit of, take a step back and think about, well, what if we're not bound to the way things work now, and trying to develop a new identity system that had even better properties, but sort of may possibly rethinks, the way identity provision works altogether. And this is a fairly complicated diagram showing it, which I will not review. But to describe it in essence, this is something which is not entirely novel, although it has a few new parts to it, and we'll try that tries to get to where we're going with all our goals. But the basic idea is that the identity provider can sign a certificate for the user agent that enables the user agent to issue its own identity tokens. The relying party can verify the certificate if it knows by knowing the identity provider's public key. So the identity provider can remain blind to exactly how I'm using that certificate, at least in most use cases, although we have to also consider some corner cases that might pop up, like account recovery. And that's sort of where we get into one of the deployment challenges. Because if we're getting into that, then we have we're breaking with backwards compatibility and making it a lot harder to get to where we're going. And we consider also we consider sort of the protocols that let us deploy embracing or trying to wrap existing protocols lets us deploy this faster. Potentially, like a lot of our relying parties will just embed scripts from the identity provider, and so the identity provider can modify their script and adapt to some of these changes, and you can actually get it probably deployed fairly widely with fairly small numbers of changes, but that provides a significant limitation on what we can actually do. So right, the challenges we have going forward are what what I've been talking about so far. We don't know, like there's a lot of problems with directed identifiers, like as good as they are, and they are used in some specific scenarios already. But there's things like customer support. Like if I signed into a site using a directed identifier, it's actually hard for me to identify myself globally to that relying party if I call them up on the phone because I'm having trouble with something about my account. And we have a lot of technical questions, which like how much do we use programmatic enforcement versus how much can we just set policies and ask for good behavior by identity providers, because there's relatively few of them, at least on the public web, before we consider enterprise, and also other use cases. So going forward, we have all these big discussions which are starting to take place, and we're trying to accelerate them and get as much engagement as we can and help, and trying to hammer this out into something that is both deployable and solves the problems that we were trying to solve. And yes, that is the end of it. So does anyone have any questions or comments on this? Okay, I see a question from the Open Identity Foundation. Tom Jones, you have concerns. Is there some way we can engage more deeply in the existing identity standards orgs? I think we've been trying to do that a little bit. We actually have been we've had some attendance at OAuth meetings, and we've been speaking to some of the people. In addition to that, I don't know if there's anything specific that you'd be suggesting we do there, like anything. Like in terms of what? In terms of depth? Or I don't know if the person who asked that is still with us. So, who's there? Tom Jones, can you elaborate on the question a bit? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, if I could. We've heard a little from you guys, but not very much. Is there some place where you're developing things like these APIs where we could interact?
So the WCG repo that we have on GitHub is the best place, and we have had people filing issues from identity organizations. And not as many as we'd like, but there have been some comments about use cases which we've been trying to accommodate. But I think I think we also recognize that it would be better if we could have maybe some kind of recurring meeting.
I got confused when you sort of had that issues website, and then you started introducing it on Blink as well. And so I'm trying to figure out where the discussion is actually going on.
Okay, it should be on the repo. So Blink. When we sent we sent a Blink intent to prototype, which is really an intent to prototype that we're actually, and I should have mentioned this in the presentation. We're developing a prototype of this to see where we can go to experiment with it and possibly put up something that identity providers can play with. That we are aiming could hopefully will eventually get to something we can ship, but we also we need to have this discussion, which I think the public discussion should be on the GitHub link that just went up, and that is the right place for it. To be clear on that, it's the Blink stuff is not where we're going to be defining what happens. I think, or like when we talk about like what we sent to Blink Dev.
It's fair to acknowledge, and I think it's very fair to acknowledge that we can do a better job at engaging externally with external contributors. Tom, the GitHub repo issues is certainly kind of like the canonical place, the best place to go to, but it's not the one that is most conducive for constructive conversations. We've been trying to present this at certain various places, but certainly not as effective as we can. We're certainly, there's certainly an area that we're trying to get better. If you have any ideas, feel free to connect directly with us, and we'll try to make this better. So like Ken was saying, one of the things that we're trying to set up is a recurring deep dive meeting where we invite folks and they can come. And so certainly this will be an evolving process. Justin, do you have anything else that you want to update?
No, the only thing I'll add is, so within the YCG repo, we're going to be, working to host a recurring live discussion around WebID. So that's something that we're just figuring out the logistics around, and we'll post that as an issue. So I think that'll be another great ongoing channel for us to have live conversations around this proposal.
Oh yeah, Tom, just to plus one here, it would be helpful if you could come to us with a specific engagement model or proposal or any suggestion that you may have. We're open to suggestions. Vittorio and George Fletcher from OpenID Foundation have been helping us a lot, and one of the things that they're coming up with is writing a doc with use cases that they want to preserve. So that might be one venue, but if you have other ideas, we're open to hearing from you.
This is an area that the team has had active discussion about. We recognize that there are a lot of different stakeholders and forums in this area, and we're trying to figure out how to engage well with them without diffusing it too much. So Tom, with what your suggestion in the chat, with your willingness to be able to help drive and present a position from OIDF within the forums, like the discussion that was trying to get going within YCG and what Sam and Ken have been talking about, super appreciated. And any other thoughts like that along those lines of how we can better engage with the community and get the discussion that is necessary in this important and tricky area is super appreciated.
So yeah, the engagement thing better engagement is one of the things we need to really work on. But does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, there's a couple people with their hands up. Howard Wolowski, I think, was first.
Okay.
Hi, thanks. Hi, I'm coming from Edge. This is actually an area that I've been looking at as well for a number of months. And I've been looking at it from possibly extending the web authentication API credential management perspective. And then I kind of came across your project, and I've been looking into it and meaning to reach out. So some of the, what you're doing, I think is great. You're definitely covering areas that I hadn't been considering. But there are some things I was wondering if you've given some consideration to yet. So about the experience when maybe there's only one IDP supported, and the browser already knows about multiple identities from that IDP. So maybe I have multiple Google accounts, and now I'm logging into a Google property, and does it can WebID offer me up, show me all the ones I could just choose from so I can click, or I'm going to go through a couple scenarios. There's that, or the possibility on Windows, you're able to authenticate multiple Microsoft identities, Microsoft accounts with the operating system. And so the idea that we could either those accounts or the ones that you're logged into through your profiles in your browser could be exposed through WebID, so that when you're going to authenticate with WebID, you could just select one of the ones that's already there. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to how further integration can happen, so that there's what that might look like with WebID, so that there's users have already authenticated, they don't have to, there's a minimal amount of additional clicks that they have to do that authentication with the requesting site.
So certainly we have been considering those, or some of those things, not all of them, because a few things there. One of them was, yeah, like when you talked about, like when I was showing the mediation flow, where accounts become aware, where the browser becomes aware of user accounts, then yeah, you can imagine like having an account selector dialog like it. We hadn't actually considered too much, or particularly integrating with a platform account system, or even the browser profiles. I guess personally, I'm not sure how easy that is in terms of like whether we want to design how much we want to design a web platform API that relies on browser specific or platform specific functionality like that. But I can see that that might be worth exploring, actually, if we think about the usability benefits that might come from it. It could also be something that could get added onto this later on. Like it could be we could be adding shortcuts where the browser knows about knows about this account system, where it's able to either on your phone or on your desktop it plug into a platform API. And that can expose certain accounts, and then it can learn what it needs to, and enable some sort of sign in for it. So that would, I think that's something that could, that might be feasible eventually and beneficial. But as I said, we haven't really thought too much about that particular angle.
Okay, I'll look at opening up an issue, and maybe we can re-engage on this topic within GitHub.
That would be great. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks. Eric, I see your hand up.
Yeah. So I was wondering where you are with thinking about directed identifiers and more required versus it's a great thing for IDPs to offer, and you might have different UX affordances based on that. And I guess this gets a little bit into the enterprise doc Sam just linked to, but enterprise is not necessarily enterprise managed, right? On my home machine, I can log into all kinds of Microsoft enterprise related sites and access them. So I was wondering if you have like a lot of clarity on what's likely to be required versus just, we'll have different UX flows where users are informed about the privacy implications.
So far, we think it's hard to require directed identifiers. For one thing, there's just cases that, like, if you've created, any accounts that exist today, for instance, any federated identity accounts that don't have directed identifiers, or like on the open web anyway, attached to them. Or even if we roll this out, then if you have a browser that doesn't require them, and you set it up, or you set it up from you create a federated account through an app, like that's not even on the web, that doesn't have directed identifiers attached to it. But further than that, I think there's use cases where legitimately relying parties really need to know like a real email address, and which is and not in a directed way for liability reasons. And so what we have been thinking of is that we can make it when directed identifiers are available and offered and used, then we can make an easier flow, because there are fewer tracking implications to it, and the user inherently has more control of what's going on. But that's where we are with thinking on that. So.
Okay, yeah, I think that largely aligns with what we're thinking. It was a little hard to tell from the explainer. When we say IDP tracking problem, what do we mean by solving it? I think it's great to have IDPs be able to allow users to stay more anonymous. But yeah, it seems very challenging to force it.
Okay.
I have a quick question. Have you folks gotten feedback from IDPs about the mediated flow? Like, I'm wondering if this is something that most IDPs are going to be like really allergic to, or if we feel like we can actually recover like the majority of common use cases.
Right. So yes, we have gotten some feedback from IDPs. The feedback generally aligns with the less browser involvement and the less disruption to existing flows, the better. And that, but I guess we haven't heard anything so far. We haven't heard anything to say no that this would sync, federated identity, or that we would stop offering the service if browsers were requiring us to intermediate in that way. We still need to engage more. Like there still needs to be more discussion happening before that's settled. But that's effectively where it is.
Thanks.
Another interesting observation is that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So so obviously the mediation variation, the problem is ossification and stagnation. The other one is innovation and competition. And so you don't have to necessarily have them as mutually exclusive. You can stagnate and increase ROI, or you can innovate and decrease ROI with permissions. So they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Neither with the delegated variation either. You can have possibly. Maybe that's the answer, is to have all of them.
There was other hands, but I don't. Is there an easy way to see whose hand went up earlier?
Yes, in the people list, people with their hands raised appear on the top.
Okay. Okay, maybe it's no longer raised because I saw some go up earlier, but. All right, is that it? Any other questions, or should we wrap up? All right, I'll take that as a no. Thank you very much for your time and coming to this. Hopefully it gives you an idea of where this is going.
If I could ask one question then, since we still have the time. The concern that was raised was getting in the user's face too often. And we wondered if there was some thought given to the possibility of using something like the password manager or some way to remember a decision within the browser so that you wouldn't keep annoying the user.
Yeah, I maybe should have been a little bit clearer about that. But yeah, once a permission has been given, it should be persisted as much as possible. That, like, for instance, once I sign in, if I sign into New York Times with my Google account and then I'm prompted and I click through these permissions, then there's no reason, when I go back and do the same thing again later to re-sign in, there's no reason there should be any permission dialogues, because the browser should already know that the information has been shared. There's no new tracking risk being created, if I'm being, so I maybe should have been clear about that a lot of these times are first-time flows, but you can see it, you might see them too if you're signing in with a fresh browser profile or on a different device, unless you have some kind of sync enabled where the permissions can be propagated across them. So the first-time flows are still a concern, but it's true that we will be doing our best to minimize them as in practice.
Tom, just another example of kind of a topic that is worthwhile digging into moving forward is around permissions. Is if a user has decided they want to trust an IDP in one context on one website, how does that transfer to additional websites? That's another example where you could imagine that limiting potential consent moments, but it's one of those, I think, open topics we need to dig into more.
Yeah, so the one I posted was the case of Verizon, where you might be logged on to AOL and go to Yahoo. Well, that's considered within the same family. How does a directed identifier deal with families of sites?
It may not, right? This may be one of those cases for first-party sets.
That would be interesting to dig into that a little bit if we have the time.
Yeah, I guess like one thing that you could imagine is like if we're persisting these permissions, instead of maybe persisting like the IDP site relationship, you would instead persist the IDP like first party set owner relationship. And that way, if you're trying to use the IDP to do federated login on any of the sites in the first party set, you would use the site owner, the set owner as your scoping. So you would kind of like automatically get permission. on any of those sites. I think that's one maybe somewhat natural way to think of how you could relax the permission a little bit.
Yeah, that sounds to me like the canonical case for first-party sets. And a lot of this will come in as we look into enterprises. So like Eric was saying, much of the registration of IDPs may be different too for enterprises. So certainly I think there's the enterprise world, I think, may create different affordances, different UX affordances.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I think we can wrap up and file an issue or ping any of us if you want to, if you have any other questions or things or to follow up. Have a good one.